So welcome back to the Seeker Strength YouTube. Today's lecture, or little theory of training, is on the subject of why you shouldn't worry about your strength numbers when you're cutting weight. So, as a viewer of this channel, very likely you're an athlete, or you're a strength training athlete, or you're a real athlete, anyone who's kind of concerned with strength training, and at some point in your career, realistically, you're going to get to a point where you want to cut weight. So for some of us, it's for competition. You're trying to be in a more favorable weight class. You might be a CrossFit athlete and you're trying to cut down on body weight, or a runner, which is not as optimal for endurance events. You might be just someone as well, very often, like a lot of you watching this, is just someone who needs to cut a little bit of fat, who wants to lose a little bit of weight. So we just want to talk to you a little bit about why, when you're making this decision to cut weight, and assume you have a good reason for it, you shouldn't worry about your kind of arbitrary strength number, so a number kind of weight on the bar to a certain extent. So very often when people come to us with this issue, and it happens so often where people are trying to cut fat, or they're trying to lose a significant amount of weight, they really worry about how can I maintain my strength numbers? How do I keep my back squat as high as it could? So let's say they hit a big back squat at a relatively high body weight, and then they're going to cut for reasons either for competition or just for body composition, and they cut maybe 10 kilos. Talk a little bit about for why maybe that's not a great idea for athletes later. But we made a decision, as a lay person or a regular old citizen, that you're just going to be less fat, and you shouldn't really worry about that number on the bar. So if you look at how you get stronger, some of the biological actions by which you get stronger. So you have things like, kind of the top of the pile, strength is definitely a skill. So there's a couple of like subsections underneath strength when you talk about strength being a skill. So you have things like just coordination. I know when you say coordination, you kind of think, oh, like tying your shoelaces or hand-eye coordination, but the movements of strength are skills that you learn. That's why some of them transfer over a little bit, but some things take a long time to kind of get a high level of finesse with them and refine their technique. So you've kind of things underneath that like voluntary activation, which is just your body gets more efficient at contracting muscles. And then you've other things, like antagonist co-activation, which is like the opposing muscle resisting a little bit the force of the contracting muscle. So you've got these kind of things that your body adapts to over time, kind of consciously through you training them, but also subconsciously your body gets a better level of efficiency when performing these movements. Then you've other things like tendon stiffness, which is an adaptation over a period of time. And then you've lateral force transmission. And then finally, one of the important ones, but no more important than the other, is hypertrophy. So muscle mass is not the only one that matters, but it's probably the only one that matters in this scenario. But if you look at all of these sections of how you get stronger, these take literally months, years, and sometimes decades for people to get a high level of efficiency to these. So these are things that take a very, very, very long time to get better at, and they don't go away that fast. So it takes a long time for them to lose them. And in most cases, if you do it for long enough, for a certain period of time, you'll never truly lose all of them. So if we look at all those things we mentioned, methods by which you get stronger, if you look at what happens during fat loss, the only one that's really at risk there of negatively impacting you is the muscle mass or hypertrophy. So we know we need muscle mass as one of the factors to get stronger. We need more contractile tissue to be stronger, to maintain our strength. So our real priority when we're trying to cut weight is trying to maintain as much muscle mass as we possibly can. So the other factors, coordination, we're not going to lose. There might be a little bit of difference coordination after your training cycle. If you've cut a significant amount of body weight, some of your leverage will be a little bit different, but the other ones, tendon stiffness, is not going to go away. Realistically, the main factor that's going to affect your strength training is the loss of muscle mass, and that's why when you're cutting weight, you shouldn't really worry about the skill of strength training. So heavier weights have their own particular skill, and you need to practice those weights to get better at them, but that's something you can practice anytime, and you still maintain your ability to practice skills. So while you're cutting, that main one really is muscle mass, and maintaining as much muscle mass as you possibly can while you're cutting weight. So forget about touching heavier weights. Too often it makes kind of for a psychological battle, and people they don't do enough hypertrophy work because they're trying to do heavier weights. It fatigues them a little bit because when you're cutting weight, you've less resources to recover from training. So your prime goal when you're cutting weight as a strength athlete is maintaining as much muscle mass as possible. And rather thinking about yourself as a strength training athlete, you should approach this like you're a bodybuilder on a cut, and you're trying to maintain as much muscle mass, and your training methods and by which you're going about that should reflect that more closely than it would someone trying to peak a squat. Because realistically, when you're cutting weight, you're not going to be able to hit a new PB. And then in terms of kind of cost benefit ratio, so if you do try kind of take away from your hypertrophy training, for example, because you've only so many resources when you're cutting weight, maybe you can maintain 95%. Maybe if you put the most amount of effort into your strength training, you could maintain 95% of what you got, or 90%. Maybe you can even equal what you've done, but realistically you've gained nothing there. You know, you're almost certainly not going to progress, but rather you're just going to take away from your ability to maintain training time that could be used to maintain more muscle mass.
Yeah, so it takes a long time for you to build up this strength, for you to have all those necessary adaptations. And the next kind of logical question moving on from there is, well, how long is it going to take me to lose fat, or how long is it going to take me to drop body weight? The answer to this really is it depends, and like so often it is up to you how aggressive you want to go with a cutting phase. And I think the major shift, or the major trend with a lot of athletes, is that they want to go as fast as possible. So rather than them taking 4 months, 6 months, a year, or doing consecutive cuts broken up by a kind of in-season period, they'll want to do a really aggressive 2 or 3 month cut, drop 15, 20 kilos, and then get back to training straight away. And what we're going to look at now is like why that may not be a great idea. Okay, if you're an athlete and you're currently sitting at maybe 115 kilos and you were 95 kilos in the past, and you want to get back to that similar level of body composition or how you felt when you were 95 kilos, you have a few options, right? The first option is you drop 20 kilos in 3 months. You basically drop a lot of that through kind of dropping muscle density. You're going to strip off a lot of muscle off your frame as you're reducing your body weight. You might lose some fat along the way, but you're probably going to crash a lot of other kind of coexisting systems at the same time. Another option there would be you do 2 cuts broken up by an in-season block. So it might be, I will do 2 months of a cut, or I will do 10 weeks of a cut. I'll then take 2 or 3 months of like normal training, so normal concurrent periodized training, where I'm going to be focusing on my strength or focusing on my sport. I'll be maintaining that body weight and probably maintaining that body composition, possibly improving it slightly. And then after those 3 months of training, I will go for another 10 weeks or 8 weeks of a cut and probably get down closer to that 95 kilo mark again. There are certain advantages obviously to doing it in this kind of 2-stage or 3-stage approach, depending on how much body weight you have to lose. One of these advantages is that cutting weight and getting better body composition is definitely a skill, right? So in the same way you started learning about recovery when you started training, or you started getting better skill around the movements of weightlifting or powerlifting or whatever it is you do, cutting weight and getting better at kind of controlling calorie intake, increasing NEAT, doing certain things to increase BMR, all of these things will become easier and easier the more you do them, the more experience you gain. So rather than it being this crash course over the course of 3 or 4 months where I try and get all the way down in one go, I'll now have a more sustainable approach where I'm learning more the whole time. The other thing, and the reason it might be a better option to do it in multiple stages, is we talked about the stripping of muscle tissue when you're losing weight, right? So muscle is incredibly expensive to hold on to. If you are in a survival situation, your body doesn't want you to be this giant, jacked individual. It wants you to have an effective amount of fat storage so it can store energy and fat. And then it doesn't want all this additional muscle tissue that it has to be maintaining in terms of energy output. It also costs a lot more energy to kind of move big muscles around, right? So if I do one giant cut and I put my body into a period of fairly significant stress, the muscle mass is going to be one of the first things that will strip off, right? So people think if they go into a 1,000 calorie deficit immediately, so if they go from eating 3,500 calories a day, their BMR might, or their basal rate might be somewhere around 3,000, but they immediately go down to 2,000 calories a day. That muscle tissue is going to be one of the first things that's stripped off the frame, because your body needs to make itself a more efficient unit to be moving around, and then it will start stripping off surplus adipose tissue. Right, the next piece then is, when should I start scheduling these, right? Obviously we want to have a good plan. We want to kind of set out how long we're going to be in a fat loss phase or a cutting phase for. What I would start doing is I'd initially look at my competition calendar. At the moment, there aren't really any competitions happening, but what we start seeing is like forecasts of competitions. So there's probably going to be competitions later next year, or we might understand that a rugby season will probably start in September. So that's when I need to be back in like game shape for. What I'd start doing then is seeing if I have enough time to do these multiple blocks of weight loss. What I'd also start looking for is like, what's the magnitude of weight I need to lose? I think if the weight is significant enough, you need to start looking at years down the line, and it might be that you're not going to be competing in your goal weight class or in your current weight class for maybe 24 months or 20 months, just so I can have multiple periods of effective fat loss, and I'm not going to strip all of that contractile tissue off my frame. To give a quick example here, right, if I'm currently 110 kilos and I want to compete in the 96 kilo class, that means as an athlete, I'm probably going to walk around 99, 100 kilos or do most of my training there. So I probably have 10 kilos realistically to lose. If I want to lose this 10 kilos, and if I'm particularly involved in the sport of weightlifting or powerlifting, I'll probably say, okay, I want to max out sometime in December, and I would start a cutting phase now. So we are in the second week in February right now. I would say from this day on, I'm going to do 2 months, so 8 weeks. That will take me through to the second week in April. I'd probably then go back to normal training and normal calorie intake until somewhere around the start of August. So that'll give me a good few months of proper training where I'm not in a sufficient deficit. Then somewhere around the start of August, I do a second kind of mini cut. I would do that for probably 8 weeks again, and hopefully get down much, much closer to that 100 kilo mark. And then I would go again into my actual training routine. Obviously, if you wanted to do this in a more concurrent fashion where you're just in a slight deficit all the time, you certainly could do that. But for the reasons Owen mentioned, where you are going to be losing some sort of strength the entire time you're in a surplus, it might be better to split it up into these two kind of more focused blocks. The other advantage of doing this in those kind of mini blocks is it means when I'm training, I can actually focus on strength work, I can actually focus on power and speed work. During those 2 month periods or those 10-week periods, I can then understand that, look, strength is going to be sacrificed here, but I can't worry about it. It's something you shouldn't be taking up all this cognitive capital thinking about, oh, my numbers are going down, my top end squat numbers are going down. Just understand it's going to happen and kind of be at peace with that. Understand as well that you have another training block planned out in a few months' time where you're going to get better strength numbers, but right now you need to not worry so much about that. During these periods of training then, what goals should you have in mind? A lot of the time, as strength athletes or as people who enjoy lifting weights, the numbers we have in mind are always to do with squat, bench, deadlift, snatch, clean, power clean, whatever it is. For these periods, you're going to look for something different. The first thing you're going to look for is actual weight on the scales. And this is something that in like all different forms of media kind of gets demonized. If you're an athlete and you're looking to make alterations in body composition, the number one thing you're going to look at is actual body weight. So get yourself a scales if you don't already have one. Make sure it's in like a prominent location. So if that's like next to your bed and you write down your weight every morning as you step out of bed, that's probably going to be the easiest way to go about it. I spoke earlier about like how much weight you could probably expect to strip off in a certain time period. Obviously, for certain people, it's going to be easier. For certain people, it's going to be much, much more difficult. And the magnitude of weight will kind of dictate the time frame itself. I would also say look at like very, very short-term goals. So look at like 6 weeks, 4 weeks for the actual changes you want to make. Make sure you're looking at rate factors. So like how many kilos I want to change per week. So a kilo a week is an absolutely giant amount. Like realistically for most people, if you're in a fairly intensive phase of weight loss, probably 2 kilos a month is going to be a lot. And that's the first thing I'd look at. Set a number, make sure you're hitting that number consistently. The next thing I'd look at then is something more kind of qualitative, something more along the lines of training goals, or a thing we've called in the past, be a better athlete goal. So Gurf talked a lot about hypertrophy training. Other kinds of training that might be important are like aerobic training or just general cardio training when you're in one of these phases. It might be something as simple as I want to be able to run 5 kilometers without being like super out of breath or sore for 3 days afterwards. It might be something like, I want to be able to do a certain sets of curls and tricep extensions without having DOMs for 48 hours afterwards. Simple things like this, like go to the gym, understand the bodybuilding movements, understand which ones you're going to be really focusing on, and set some goals around those. Other classic goals would be like, okay, I'm not going to deviate outside my training plan for 3 weeks in a row. And for a lot of guys and girls, when they're in a weight loss phase, their programming and their planning of training tends to go to shit. So if you're in one of those situations, like say, I'm going to stick to my program, I'm not going to go deviate from my program and kind of look for little wins here and there, like set a goal of being a better athlete and try and hit that. Hopefully this video has helped you kind of demystify some of the areas of, you'll hear people talking about, oh, you could still get stronger while you're on a cut. It can probably happen, but it's not going to happen for you.
So then once your training block is over, so you've gone through, however, like Dara talked through there, the period of time where you would be cutting weight and how long that would last. Then when you come into your new training block, you can begin that process of trying to regain strength and then use that muscle mass, the most amount of muscle mass you possibly maintained, and use that then go into your new training block and then try to either equal at a better body weight, or potentially even in a given enough period of time, you're trying to improve beyond what you previously did.
So if you're in this situation, I really hope it did help. We're going to be doing more videos along these lines in the next few months. If you have questions, post them in the comments below, or if you just have general comments, post them below as well. If you could like the video and subscribe to the channel, it would be really helpful to us. And we'll put a link to our podcast in the description below. Thanks, guys.